going on? Oh, hi, I didn't recognize you. Nice to see you. My name is Damaris Reynolds, and
where were you born?
I was born in I still call it Peking, but Beijing, and lived my early years in Beijing and Tsingtao, and finally went to Washington, D.C. for my high school years.
And what year were you born?
I was born in 1913.
So how old does that make you?
So I'm pretty old. So China has just always been part of my psyche, as it were.
Okay.
Partly also, I imagine, because my father was born and brought up there.
Mm-hmm.
My father was born in 1881.
And where was
in
your
Tianjin.
In Tianjin.
Must have left San Francisco middle of June. I was in Nanjing by the end of July, and of course in those days it took about 3 weeks to cross the Pacific, so I must have left early June.
Mm-hmm. So that's right around when
So,
the summer rains were building up and the floods
and,
were starting to hit around.
Yeah, and I don't remember what month the Lindberghs arrived.
Oh, the Lindberghs arrived in September, on the 19th. So they came about a month or even a month and a half after the floods had already had the big height of the floods.
Yeah.
So
and,
where were you? Did you go down to the river to greet them with your father?
Well, what happened was they were scheduled to land in the river, the Yangtze. And when Lindbergh flew over the river, there was so much traffic in the river that he did not want to land there. He didn't think it would be safe. And there is a big lake outside of Nanjing. We called it Lotus Lake. I don't know what the Chinese name is. And so the communication was handled by radio between Lindbergh and the US Navy ship that was anchored in the river at Nanjing. So then we went out to Lotus Lake, which was outside the city wall, and he had to land out in the lake. There was no pier that he could pull up to. So we went out, and there were lots of little boats on the lake because it was a great resort, kind of holiday place.
And
so,
was he already landed on the lake?
So
when
we
you got
just
there?
went out in sampans, and my parents, and probably Russell Jackson from the Standard Oil may have been there too, because they were going to see that he got his aviation gas that he needed for his plane.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so did you go out in the sampans to meet the plane?
Yes.
So you rode out to the Sirius?
To there, and we must have been several, because I think you only have 3 or 4 passengers in each sampan. So, if my mother and dad and I went, and probably other members of the embassy went too, and maybe we all went. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we had our cars there, and then we drove back to the embassy.
Okay, so do
and
you
then
remember
Lindberghs
that?
were house guests of my parents for the time that they were there.
Okay.
I don't know how long that was. But a couple of things I remember later from that. One day we went on a picnic, and outside of Nanjing, and I don't remember whether you ever hear of it, did you ever hear about the lions of Liang? Great huge stone animals? Yeah, well, we took the Lindberghs to see those. And it was outside of town, and we drove in car some way, and then we walked, and we had to walk through a little village to get there. And Lindbergh said, "This is the first time since I made my flight that I haven't been followed by a crowd." And he was just loving it, that they had finally had some privacy.
You mean since the flight, the Spirit of St. Louis, since
Since
1927?
the Spirit of St. Louis flight, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, first time since the Spirit of St. Louis flight that he hadn't had a crowd, and he just thought that was so great. I think they really enjoyed their time there because, except for people coming to the house or something like that, he was pretty much had a private life.
Mm-hmm.
But he was also helping and doing the things for the flood.
Yeah. Now, do you remember? Did your mother plan a gathering? For
Oh,
the Lindberghs
Mother
when they
had planned
arrived?
all kinds of parties for the top Chinese government officials and foreign diplomats, and you couldn't buy much fancy in the way of groceries in Nanking, so she'd ordered things from Shanghai and, you know, turkeys or whatever like that, special thing for a big party. But the first thing Lindbergh said was, no parties. I want to spend my whole time doing what I can to help the flood relief. So all the parties were canceled. We used to have, and maybe you remember it, June, a fruit we call pomelo, like a grapefruit, about so big, but you could peel it and the inside comes apart like a tangerine does, not like a grapefruit does. And so we used to have those for breakfast. And Lindbergh thought that was the best thing he had ever eaten. He just thought pomelos were wonderful.
Remember anything about
well,
when they went to Tsinghua?
I remember the day that he came back, landed, when they had had all these crowd of boats come around his plane, and that he was visibly shaken by that incident, of that, you know, that had happened, because I guess it was a near disaster of that. And another time that I remember, one day we were going out, and I don't know why I was there unless I was thinking about it the other day, possibly because I spoke pretty fluent Chinese in those days. And maybe I went along as an interpreter, I don't know. But we went out in the sampan to the boat, to the plane, and I think one of the Standard Oil men, maybe Fuzzy Vaughn, was along. I think we were taking gas out, cans of gas out to refuel the plane. And as we got near the plane, we could see there were a number of people climbing all over it. And of course, he was very upset at that. Well, I let loose a string of Chinese profanity that I didn't know I knew, but I'd heard it enough on the streets as a child, I guess. So I let loose of that, and they got off in a hurry. Really obscene language. It's the first time since the transatlantic flight that he'd been able to go any place without a crowd following him. It was on this excursion. Oh, that looks like Sun Yat-sen tomb in the background. This man is Russell Jackson. He was head of Standard Oil. There, and Margaret Jackson, his wife.
I think that's Purple Mountain in the background, which is where Sun Yat-sen, you're exactly right.
Does that look like Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum?
Yes, it does. That's where that is. I've been out to that place. I think you're in that one.
Oh, yeah. This is the guy who was a photographer. This is my husband, to-be.
I gotta see that.
That doesn't look just like Tom Wales, but it must be.
Which is your husband?
I'm trying to think who that is.
Which one's your husband?
This one. Tom Reynolds. Fantastic, these pictures. Well, I don't remember anything particularly except the one memory that my mother and I talked about in later years was going, my mother taking her around to see the shops in Nanking, and Mrs. Lindbergh bought a pair of little Chinese children's red satin shoes for her little boy, and she was so excited about getting those. And of course they couldn't buy much because there wasn't room on the plane to have much stuff, but she bought those. And of course that was the little boy that later was kidnapped. Yeah. So Mother and I used to talk about how tragic that was.